We all long for the day when the house of our dreams, whether it's a New England cabin or a Malibu beach house, falls into our laps. Alas, that dream might not become a reality for most of us. However, when it does become a reality, that reality may come with strings. Such was the case for a homeowner named Chris, who got his hands on the house of his dreams only to realize that all was not as it seemed. Resting on a woodland field in California, seemingly in the middle of nowhere, was homeowner Chris's dream house. Chris knew he had to have it the second he saw it, and he couldn't spare a moment before calling the real estate company to ask about the ad. As he walked with the realtor through the mansion, Chris loved the home, but he truly had no idea what would befall him, thanks to the beautiful property. Christopher loved the home, and he also loved the surrounding forest. Perhaps he was being a bit rash, agreeing to purchase a home so quickly. That was certainly the opinion of Chris's family and friends, Chris's dad in particular. After his purchase, Chris had everyone over for a housewarming party. Once the guests had left, the darkness pressed against the home's tall, floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Chris turned on the electric fireplace, feeling content in his new abode. "There are a lot of mines around here," his father's voice said behind him. "Quite a few." "Mines?" Chris asked. "I wasn't told about that. There aren't any workers around, though." He looked out the windows, but all he saw was dense, sparse forest. He cleared his throat and stepped back, unwilling to let his dad ruin this for him. "Old ones," his dad said, "so just be careful if you're walking around." "Yeah, I will." Chris let his dad's words slip from his mind at that point, though he remembered them later on in the night as he was trying to fall asleep. There had been a long mining history in the region, about which Chris was vaguely cognizant, and intimidating him, if he was being honest. If there were mines on his property, they were abandoned, and technically, Chris was their owner now. Thinking about what his dad said, Christopher went on a walk the next day. It was a beautiful spring Saturday, the temperatures just starting to warm up, and Christopher had all the acres to himself. Chris found nothing on that first hike, though he was continuously amazed by the forest around him. All of this is mine, he thought. He wanted to have a family one day, and he pictured his kids running around the woods, playing like he did as a child at his grandparents' house. Was there a tree, Chris thought? Just a small, dark, weirdly old one? "That's not it," he muttered to himself. "It's a sort of passage out." Before he could finish his sentence, he stumbled, feeling his feet leave the ground beneath him as he tumbled into a short, 3-foot ditch. He let out a yelp of shock, both of his ankles tingling with pain as he hit the ground hard. He wasn't hurt, though there would be more of an answer to that in the morning. "I have to be careful out here," Chris thought. If something happened, there was no one around for miles to help him. He could scream his head off and no one would hear. It was easy to see how Chris missed it, as the ditch had been covered in mud and leaves. It was almost like a trap placed there purposefully. But why would someone put this here, Chris thought. He got his answer when he scrambled out of the ditch and looked up. In front of him was what unmistakably had to be the entrance to an old mine. His dad was right. Chris had always had a fear of the darkness. Headlamp, Chris thought. He grabbed his backpack and rummaged through it to find his headlamp. He strapped it on, pulling out his flashlight for extra illumination. The exterior of the mine was covered in moss, while the interior was straight up rocks and dirt. As Chris made his way through the mine, the temperature dropped and he found himself traveling down a slope. Gold, Chris thought. It had to be. He stepped closer. The stones in the wall were sparkling, but Chris couldn't tell the difference between fool's gold and real gold that easily. Cold, icy fear seized Chris's heart when he realized he heard noises in the tunnel ahead of him. He had no idea what he was about to find. Chris steeled himself. This was his property and his mine. He walked forward, swearing that he heard footsteps behind him, but whenever he stopped, the sound of the footsteps stopped too. Chris stopped. He went to turn back, deciding he'd had just about enough of this fool's errand. Chris noticed that there were now streaks of gold in the walls of the mine. That should have come as a delight to him, but he kept asking himself why this gold was never mined, even though equipment to do so was right there. What happened here? Chris asked himself. Where did the miners go? Chris stuck his hands out as though to push back a menacing beast. He then sprinted back through the tunnel the way he'd come. The daylight burnt his retinas, but he didn't care. He was so excited to breathe in the forest air again, to be away from the oppressive blackness of the mine and its ghosts. As he got in the door, a new emotion popped up. Chris pulled out his phone and punched in the number for the one person he needed to talk to. "What the hell was that? Why didn't you tell me? You have a lawsuit coming, buddy," Chris snapped at the realtor. "I'm sorry, we'll send someone to take a look at it," the realtor replied. Before Chris could respond, the realtor hung up the phone. Of course, his next call was to his father. "I told you so," his dad said. Chris grumbled in acknowledgement in reply. The area is home to a bunch of mining sites in the forest. They worked in them at the turn of the century, but then the gold and coal or whatever was in there dried up. Now most of them are abandoned, well, not so abandoned according to you. After speaking to the realtor and his father, Chris began to feel a little calmer. He'd go to sleep until the doorbell rang at 8 a.m. sharp. Chris whipped the door open and stood, staring out at the small, spectacled, bow-tie-wearing man in front of him. The man extended his flat, square palm, saying, "Hello, I'm Mr. Rutherford." "I apologize for the early call," Rutherford said, "but I'm from the real estate company. I wanted to take a look at what you found yesterday. What's this about some sparkling walls?" The two sat down in Chris's kitchen. Chris grabbed a granola bar and strong cup of coffee. Mr. Rutherford made himself at home as Chris talked about what he'd experienced at the mine. Of course, he downplayed the part of the story where he was terrified. "Can you show me?" Rutherford asked. The pair of them headed out, both donning backpacks with supplies. Rutherford walked in, needing no introduction. Chris realized that he hadn't really said too much about himself other than that he worked for the real estate company. Rutherford's eyes gleamed as he looked at the sparkling gold lining the walls of the mine. "Chris," Rutherford began, stepping towards him. Rutherford began to talk, and Chris listened carefully. Rutherford told Chris that the mine was definitely once a gold mine, but the gold, for some reason, had remained untouched. There had been rumors of disappearances at the turn of the century, but those rumors always swirled among the men. Still, why did they leave? It was now Chris's turn to play skeptic, never mind the fact that he'd been scared pantsless the other day. "So you're telling me that they left this gold here because of ghosts?" Rutherford shrugged. "Or gases, fumes, strikes, whatever. It's hard to tell." "Let's press on," he said to Chris. The two of them went through the mine, reaching the point where Chris had stopped the day before. The pair walked further down the mine, boots squelching on the wet ground until they finally reached the source of the water. The source of the water was a door. "No, don't," Chris started as Rutherford pushed it open. But it was too late. Beyond the door, water falling from the ceiling was the shock of Chris's life. It looked like an old hideout or bunker. Hallways stretched past the door's entryway and the walls were covered in graffiti and who knew what else. Chris stepped forward despite himself. He saw a bed and mattress farther down the hallway and said to Rutherford, "I think someone lives here." Was someone living down here? Or were they forced to stay down here? Chris pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and he took a photo of what he saw. The second the flash sounded, there was a huge crashing noise, making Chris jump several feet into the air. This place is haunted, Chris thought. A haunted house. Looking over, he saw Rutherford kicking in a door to one of the rooms in the hallway. He disappeared from Chris's sight, forcing the man to run after him. Chris followed him, seeing that the man had gone up a flight of stairs. "Rutherford?" Chris called out. "What is this place? Do you know?" The man clomped up in front of Chris, his feet stomping upstairs in a way that made Chris uneasy. Chris began looking for an exit from the abandoned home, and he could hear scuffles upstairs. He hoped they were mice or rats. For the second time that day, Rutherford began to talk, and boy, he had a lot to say. This house had once been in his family, and he had been looking for a way into the mine for ages. He'd only recently stumbled upon the lower level, but he hadn't found the door until today. Though he'd moved down the road, Rutherford had a lot of friends in the community. Rutherford, not one to turn down an opportunity, had seized upon it, making sure to show up as soon as he could the next day. "I've been looking for this for a long time," Rutherford told Chris. "I'm sorry I lied." "I guess you're not from the real estate company then," Chris said dully. Rutherford laughed. "No, I'm not." Rutherford had a claim to this house, and Chris wasn't sure if they were even still on his property line. "So, what now? You found what you were looking for. Let's call it a day." Rutherford acted like he didn't even hear Chris. "In the mid-1800s, you know," he said. "Men borrowed money, sold their homes, lived on the street, spent their life savings, all to find some gold in the mines. They called it gold fever, and I think my family had a touch of it themselves." Chris nodded. Were they miners? Rutherford grunted an affirmation as the sounds above grew louder and more frenetic. I'd always heard rumors we had our own mine. I bought the place, Chris said. It's my house. I earned it. The mine is on my property, not yours. I am not afraid of you. The clattering above grew even louder. Finally, Rutherford seemed as though he were unable to continue to ignore it. He sighed, turned on his heels, and began to walk upstairs. Of course, Chris didn't follow him. When he saw Rutherford was out of sight, he quickly crept back towards the exit. He made it through the basement as quietly as he could, reaching the entrance of the door to the mine. The water dripped so loudly Chris felt it in his bones. The home hadn't had any water damage, something Chris found unusual. Though the door was the source of water, it was the basement that was damp, not the home. Chris was sure that if he'd pressed on, he'd have found a lagoon in the basement. That lagoon was none of his business as far as he was concerned. All he wanted was to get away from Rutherford as fast as he could. Was the man dangerous? Chris asked himself as he moved through the mine quietly and efficiently. He made it back down to where he had seen the hanging rusty chains when he heard an awful wailing. The wailing sounded almost feminine. Then Chris heard his name screamed, the sound so loud it echoed off the walls of the mine. That was definitely Rutherford's voice. Chris began to run, moving blindly as he sought to escape the mine again. Rutherford was behind him. He and Chris looked at each other for a moment, Chris ready to run at any moment. "What now, Rutherford?" Chris said it defiantly, as though daring the man. Rutherford said nothing, staring at him with black, beady eyes. "Don't ever come on my property again," Chris said, his voice flat and level. "I'll call the cops." Chris stood his ground as he watched the little man turn on his heel and walk back into the trees. Chris waited a long time before returning to his house. When he got to the kitchen, he was surprised to find a light on. Did he leave it on? Did Rutherford? Chris wasn't sure. Sighing, he reached for his phone to call the police. By the time the police left, they snidely characterized the situation as a neighbor dispute. Chris was exhausted. He made sure all of his doors and windows were locked before retiring to bed early. At 5 in the morning, Chris awoke with that thought of certainty in his head. As if on autopilot, he crept over to the window, peeling back the drapes ever so slightly. There was nothing, except in the distance at the edge of the tree line. Chris swore he saw a small man standing in the gloom. The longer he looked, he thought he saw the man's eyes reflecting in the moonlight, giving them a milky white sheen. He did some online research before deciding to cave and call a lawyer. The lawyer said that he could sell the mine after having it appraised. The appraisal of the mine went well, and Chris inked a deal that was worth millions. He was already a successful businessman, and this helped add even more clout to his name. He wondered what Rutherford thought, whether the man was still out there pining. "It's out of my hands now," Chris thought to himself. He can take it up with Braxton. Braxton Elements, Inc. was the name of the company to which Chris sold the mine. Went to the bank and deposited his check. He checked his emails, began work, and talked to BEI about their plans to have miners come and get the gold from the mines. Chris knew that once the gold was gone, he'd finally be able to relax in his own home. "We have a good group," Braxton's representative told him. "Good foremen, good workers. We'll get this done quickly." And get it done they did. The workers were done removing the gold within a couple of months' time, and Chris felt a huge weight off of his shoulders as he moved on with his life. He even got a girlfriend and considered proposing to her. He always wondered how the miners hadn't found the abandoned house. He'd heard nothing about it, but of course there was a good reason for that. "Everyone did a really nice job," Chris said to BEI's representative when the mine operations were complete. "This was done so quickly, thank you." "We had a good foreman," the rep said. "He kept everyone on task. Not much of an intimidating-looking guy, but he kept everyone moving. Seemed like he's done this work for a while." Chris swallowed, feeling unease bloom in his chest. He went to ask the foreman's name, but he couldn't bring himself to voice the words.